So welcome everybody to the last meeting of the speaker series of Women, Tradition and Change in Israeli Society, sponsored by the Bellsberg Postdoctoral Program in Israel Studies, Department of Classics and Religion, and Department of Anthropology and Archaeology of University of Calgary, in collaboration with the Midrash Arevot, Women Within Tradition. It is a pleasure to welcome our last speaker, Yafa Benaya. As usual, before introducing our speaker today, I would like to say a few words about Arevot and the women that are behind this project for those who might not know about them. So Arevot is an organization and a Bet Midrash or House of Learning in Jerusalem, devoted to the study of Sephardi Mizrahi Judaism and history from a feminist perspective. It is the first Bet Midrash of its kind, and it works as a laboratory of a feminist Mizrahi Jewish thought. On top of being a community of women from the most diverse backgrounds, a multi-generational community where different approaches to Judaism, tradition, change, and feminism meet. And as I've mentioned in the past, for me, Arevot is also my natural space and one of my communities of reference, where I continue to learn and build knowledge in collaboration with friends who are also mentors. Yafa Benaya is our speaker today and one of these friends and mentors. She is an educator and activist in the Mizrahi and traditionist field. She's a research fellow at the Shalom Hartman Institute in Jerusalem and a lecturer at Ono Academy. Benaya participates in programs which deal with racism and coexistence at Shatil, Israel's leading empowerment and training center for social change organizations, and the Department of Justice in Israel. Her research studies Sephardi Mizrahi Jewish women and Jewish traditionist identity in Israel. She was among the founding members of Mimizrach Shemesh, the Bet Midrash or House of Study for Social Leadership. She is also an active member of Tikkun, an organization for social and cultural renewal in Israel. And finally, Yafa Benaya is one of the founders of Arevot, Women Within Tradition. And to me, she's also a dear friend and someone from whom I have learned so much. So please welcome Yafa Benaya.
Okay, should I start?
Yeah, you can start whenever you want.
So hi everyone from Jerusalem. I'm pleased to meet you. And thank you, Angie, for inviting me to speak in this series about women, tradition, and modernity. I would like to apologize in advance for the mistakes I will probably make in English. And now we can start. In this talk, I want to present two women. Each one was a trailblazer in her own way in the history of Sephardi and Mizrahi Judaism. Through their biographies and the texts they wrote, we will look at questions such as, what is Sephardic modernity? Does it differ from other forms of modernity, for example, that of European Judaism? And if so, how? When we talk about modernity and the encounter between Judaism and modernism, the picture in our minds is exclusively European. But of course, Judaism encountered modernism in Islamic countries too, in the Maghreb and throughout the Mediterranean basin. The sociologist Shmuel Noach Eisenstadt, a well-known Israeli sociologist, talks about multiple modernities. In other words, there is more than one type of modernity, and not every modernity is like that of Europe. So we will examine this question of the Sephardic modernity through the voices of two women on three different axes: the East-West axis, the axis of Jewish identity, and the axis of women's feminist identity. I would like to add that our knowledge about women in Sephardi and Mizrahi Judaism is quite limited, partly because at the period in question, there were still few women writers or even women who were literate. and partly because those who did create and write have been deleted from history and forgotten. In the Aravot Beit Midrash, we are accumulating information about these women, rescuing them from oblivion and returning them to the pages of history. I myself was born in Casablanca and made Aliyah to Israel with my family when I was 9 years old. I never learned about these women in any context until I began researching the topic from personal interest in my heritage and my history. The two women I will introduce you are Esther Moyal, born in Beirut, Lebanon in 1873, who was, as we shall see, at home in Arab and Middle Eastern culture, and Jacqueline Kahanov, who was born in Egypt, Cairo, in 1917 and moved to Israel in her late 30s. These women lived in different generations, but the two of them acted in a colonial setting. Egypt was under British colonial rule and Lebanon under the French. These countries, like most of the Arab countries, were undergoing processes of modernization that had already begun under the Ottoman Empire and accelerated following the European colonial conquests. This historical detail is important for the understanding of Sephardic modernism, because the encounter with European modernism was not voluntary, but took place in the context of colonial rule. This was a context in which the Europeans saw their culture as superior to that of the natives. They believed that their conquests were driven by the need and the desire to civilize other races, lesser races. The Jewish minorities and other minorities as well in these countries found themselves in an ambivalent position. On the one hand, they were part of the subject nation, but on the other hand, as a minority, they had access to privileges that were not available to the lower class natives, like expanding economic opportunities, leading to social mobility and a rise in class, and the opportunity to receive higher education. So in this period of colonialism, Jews had an intermediate status between the local population and the European rulers. And in many cases, this created an ambivalent relationships with modernism and the West. This is a context that's important to bear in mind as we look at processes of modernization among the Jews in this context. Now, the colonial era was quite long, but the flourishing of the Jewish minority, as well as other minorities, was quite short. What put an end to it was the growth of nationalist movements, Arab and Jewish, which completely transformed Jewish history in Islamic countries, or rather put an end to that history, as the communities vanished, whether through immigration to Israel or to other countries. This was a brief rendering of the historical context. I will now proceed to tell the story of each of these women, and afterwards we will read some texts written by each of them and try to get to know and understand each one's unique voice in her own time through her own words. Esther Azhari Moyal was born in 1873 in Beirut, as I said, a port city that was undergoing demographic expansion in the late 19th century as a result of economic development, and became a Levantine community with a wide range of ethnicities, languages, and cultures. In this multilingual and multicultural context, Esther Azhari grew up and shaped her identity. a shared society with mutual relations on a daily basis between religious, cultural, and linguistic groups. Esther's family invested heavily in her education. She studied at the American College for Girls in Beirut, and her education included a knowledge of Arabic, including the Quran, the Holy Scriptures of Islam, French, and English. Later in life, she taught in Christian schools in Beirut and was principal of a Beirut Muslim girls' school. Alongside her educational activity, she studied at the American University of Beirut, where she became associated with intellectual circles aiming to convey a universalist message common to the three monotheistic religions. During her studies, she joined the Syrian Women's League, where she was active in feminist causes and was later appointed as the League's secretary. In 1894, she married Shimon Muyal, one of the founding members of the new settlement in Yafa, a medical doctor active in the Sephardi community in Israel. The couple moved between Istanbul, Beirut, Cairo, and Yafa, and wherever they lived, worked to promote the vision of a Middle East in which Arabs, Jews, and members of all religions and minorities would be able to live in harmony in a democratic and egalitarian society, promoting enlightenment and modernism. While living in Cairo, Esther Moyal founded and edited a monthly journal called El Aila, The Family, dedicated to fighting to improve the life of Oriental women and families. She constantly published articles in the Arab press on subjects related to the Arab world, educating the masses and improving the position of Oriental women. Moyal was a rising star in the firmament of Arab culture and media and a central figure in the Nahda Arabic awakening movement. Nahda means revival, awakening in Arabic. A movement which flourished at that time in all the Middle East countries. Its objective was bringing about a renaissance of Arabic culture, language, and literature alongside religious and social reform. Now, Esther Moyal identified with the Zionist movement, but she didn't identify with the Ashkenazi Zionism, we could say, that denied the existence of a Palestinian people and was built on a complete separation between Jews and Arab, Judaism and Islam. Now, Esther herself was an Arab Jew. She considered herself an Arab Jew. Her identity was shaped by the two cultures, and she imagined the Zionist movement as an inclusive one, at least at the cultural level. In 1909, Esther and Shimon Moyal returned to the land of Israel and settled in Yafa. While living there, they encountered suspicion and alienation that were mostly typical of the attitude of Ashkenazim to Sephardim in the land of Israel. Nevertheless, they continued their political and cultural activity in order to promote peace and cooperation between Jews and Arabs, Judaism and Islam. Esther Moyal's end was tragic. Her husband, Shimon Moyal, died in Yafa in 1915, aged only 49. She was left a widow at 42, had difficulties supporting herself, and was in dire straits for many years, until she died in 1948, alone and forgotten in Yafa. I will conclude the story of her life by saying that she was a groundbreaking leader ahead of her time, and in consequence, not well understood. She defined herself as an Arab Hebrew and sought to promote a vision of Jewish-Arab cooperation. She was a feminist active in promoting the status of women, and all her activity was from a position of close and detailed familiarity with Arabic language and culture, which she saw as a sister of Hebrew language and culture. Unfortunately, the path towards Jewish-Arab cooperation proposed by her and other Sephardim of her cycle became the road not taken, and history has forgotten her and her vision, which is, in my opinion, still relevant and challenging today, nowadays. The second woman whom I will discuss is Jacqueline Kahanov. Born Jacqueline Shochet in 1917 in Cairo to an Iraqi father and Tunisian mother, immigrant to colonial Egypt due to the economic and educational opportunities opening up there. Like Esther Moyal, Jacqueline grew up in a multicultural, cosmopolitan city, studied in a French school, and spoke French and English. So we can see how modern all these women can, in spite of all the prejudices that we still are subject to in nowadays about the Sephardic identity in the Islamic countries. Jacqueline was part of the process of Westernization typical of middle-class Jews in Cairo and Alexandria in the first half of the 20th century. When she was 24, she married a Russian Jewish doctor and moved with him to the USA, where she studied literature and journalism at Columbia University in New York and published personal essays and stories in English. In 1946, she was divorced and returned to Egypt, moving later to Paris, and then in 1954 to Israel, where she lived until her death from cancer at age 62 in 1979. By this time, the Jewish community in Egypt was already much diminished. From the 1930s onwards, the Jews of Egypt found themselves caught between two nationalist movements, Egyptian nationalism and Jewish nationalism. In the 1950s, we may say that the golden age of Levantine minorities in Egypt came to an end. And from 1948 to 1956, Egypt's Jewish population completely disappeared, and this vibrant and fascinating community ceased to exist. The Egyptian Jews call this movement out of Egypt, second exodus from Egypt. Jacqueline Kahanov went on writing in Israel. She wrote essays, novels, and short stories, translations, and literary criticism. All of her literary output has a strongly autobiographical character. In her writing, she sought to give a voice to the Egyptian Jewish community, a unique and exciting community that had disappeared virtually overnight. I quote from one of her essays. She writes, "After we left Egypt, our heart broke at the thought that nobody had told this story, that one of the most complex and fascinating communities had disappeared almost without leaving a trace." So in her writing and in her stories and essays, Kahanov sought to leave a trace, to capture the lost era in words and tell this story of Egyptian Jews. Okay, shall we take a break to hear comments and questions, or shall I continue, Angie?
I think you can continue because everybody's welcome to use the chat to ask questions, and then yeah.
So I want now to go back to Esther Moyal and to read one short text of her writings, and I'll share screen with you. Okay, can you see? Great. In 1911, Esther Moyal was invited to give the commencement address at the American College for Girls in Beirut. This invitation is a testimony to her status in the Arab world. And now I will read to you an extract from this address at the American College for Girls in Beirut. This is part of what she said to these girls. You see those who hold you back, whose hearts are obliterated by God, saying that there is no point in education and that every dirham spent on it is a waste, since our Eastern traditions dictate that a woman's place is in the home, where no activity enlightens her mind and no art raises her mental capacities, nor expands the boundaries of her imagination. No, my dear ladies, you will prove these demagogues utterly wrong and show that life's good things are created by us, women, that we bequeath morals to the nation's sons who are our fathers, brothers, husbands, and sons. You will appear like a fierce fighter prepared for days of danger, ready to defy and fight enemies. You will establish the civilization that we are now in as urgent need of as the food feeding our body and the air purifying our blood. This is a civilization where woman is equal to man and where woman is man's partner in the battle of life, which the stronger alone wins. That is an Arab Eastern civilization based on the inherited virtues, love for labor, and excellence in everything. You can see the passion and the enthusiasm and the sharpness of the tone of her speech. My sisters, God will not change a people until they change themselves. And this applies to us, the women of the East, in ever greater force. A woman has fearsome powers in this universe. Had it not been for her compassion, self-denial, and disregard for her own pleasures, there would be nobody left on earth. This fact is self-evident and requires no proof. This is her fate and identity. Her rights could not have been oppressed, and she would not have been left neglected between the walls of the house like a commodity that can be bought and sold, had not she surrendered to her emotions and weakness, had not her mother, harsh nature, made her breasts the source of life and her loins the factory of mankind. Note, my dear ladies, that you are Arab Syrians, and that your knowledge of English or French does not make you an English woman or a French woman. Let us stop following Westerners in every situation, whether good or bad. Let us go back and learn our language, refine its expression when we talk, and make our children keen on learning it along with the poems of our poets and the proverbs of our wise men. Let us establish an Eastern civilization in which the woman will make half the effort to promote and glorify it. For persons who do not recognize their own values or not respected. So you can see, you can pay attention to the fact that she considered herself one of them, one of these Arabic girls in Beirut. She talks about our children, our poets, our wise men. So she's totally rooted in this Arabic culture, and you can see this very, very, I mean, בצורה מאוד בהירה.
Yeah,
very clearly, yes, thank you. And I would like you to pay attention also to this last paragraph and note the ambivalence of her attitude to the West. On the one hand, she is aware of the positive values that can be adopted from the West. On the other hand, she speaks against deleting their Eastern identity and imitating Europeans. On the contrary, she says, we should adopt from them what we can use to strengthen our own Arab identity and culture. For, as she concludes her speech, persons who do not recognize their own value are not respected. Now let's turn to Jacqueline Kahanov and read some extracts of her writings. First of all, this is a picture of Jacqueline Kahanov. We don't have any picture of Esther Moyal, unfortunately. I didn't find any picture of her. This is Jacqueline Kahanov. Jacqueline Kahanov, who grew up in colonial Egypt, also displays an ambivalent attitude to the West and to the modern Western concept of progress. On the one hand, she was unquestionably Western. She described herself as Levantine, meaning of an identity combining East and West. I quote, I myself am typically Levantine in that I appreciate equally what I inherited from my Oriental origins and what is now mine of Western culture. This is on the one hand. On the other hand, she regrets the deletion and loss associated with British colonialism in Egypt, deletion of traditional Oriental culture and of the Arabic language. In the following extract that I will read, she describes the invasion of her family by an English nanny and how the nanny, who becomes a symbol of colonialism, upset the delicate relationship between the generations and the identity of the young Jacqueline. I read. In my youth, it was natural to me that the people of Cairo understand each other even though they speak different languages and are called by names from different sources: Muslim, Arab, Christian, Jewish, Syrian, Greek, Armenian, Italian. The names of the cities of Baghdad, Tunisia, Aleppo, Beirut, Damascus, Istanbul, Thessaloniki, Casablanca, Jerusalem were clear because people, especially relatives, would walk around with each other like in the rooms of one big house. So this is the beginning. This is the good epoch, the good times of this this house opened to all cultures and languages. And then she describes this invasion of the colonialism by describing the English nanny who came to her home. And she says, for me, the world began to change when an English nanny came to take care of me and the new baby, my sister. From the moment I realized that the nanny was there permanently, rooted in our lives, I thought that a nanny was like the earthquake that once struck us. At that time, things moved. All the things I was sure would never move. The floor under my feet, the lamp hanging from the ceiling, some toys that fell off their shelves. At first, I did not know that the small earthquakes a person feels in his heart change so many things, change everything, that there is no going back to what he was. So the nanny is like an earthquake that shakes all her life and identity. And she continues and says, our feelings were part of the world of our ancestors, but our behavior adapted with increasing rigidity to the models set by the nannies, which indeed slightly changed our feelings, if only because it was so clear that our ancestors were helpless in the face of the severe and hygienic world of the nannies, a world that was superior because it was the stronger side, the winning side of many present flavors that we vaguely knew. So this text contains a dramatic transition from the description of the open house inhabited by people walking around intimately and at ease to the nanny's invasion, an invasion described as an earthquake that shakes young Jacqueline's whole world during the formative years of her identity. The nanny's world is the opposite of the beloved grandmother's world, and the invasion of the nanny draws a clear demarcation line between before and after, between two worlds. And Jacqueline is caught between these two worlds, seeking intimacy with her grandmother, but already having difficulty speaking her language, Arabic. In this, she's different from Esther Moyal, as we can see. She couldn't speak Arabic anymore. Hating the nanny who invaded her secure world, but at the same time influenced by the nanny's cultural world, almost in spite of herself. This is a powerful description of transition between worlds and of the pervasive influence of Western cultural subjugation reaching the innermost core of language and identity. In another paragraph, in another essay, she describes the deletion of her culture and history in the French school she went to. And she writes, the history books taught us nothing about what had happened to us since ancient times, even though we were still here, sitting next to each other on the benches of the French school, Jews, Greeks, Armenians, and a few Muslim and Coptic girls studying French and English and learning about the French and Russian revolutions. It was as if we had never really existed, and the history we learned was like a thick veil cast over our past. In the French school, we learned to say the Gauls were our forefathers, although we all knew perfectly well that our forefathers weren't Gauls. No European history book told us anything about our role in history. We were the defeated enemy, but the history books told us nothing about the effect that the invasions, battles, and defeats had on us. And when we learned about human rights, liberté, égalité, and fraternité, this is the freedom, equality, and brotherhood of the French Revolution, and self-definition, we knew that we had not been granted any such thing, and we had no history of our own. So as I said, in her own writings, she is engaged in telling this history and bring it back to the collective memory of Judaism and Sephardic identity. Now, I would like to say a few words about her Levantine identity and her Levantinism. Levantinism for her was a statement of identity and also a political process of reclaiming, since the term Levantine was and remains a pejorative Orientalist term applied by Europeans to westernized Orientals who were seen by Europeans as ludicrous and inauthentic imitators of Western ways. Jacqueline Kahanov consciously converted the implication of the term from negative to positive. She wrote a series of essays called A Generation of Levantines in the 1960s, a period when the melting pot concept dominated Israeli society. She proposed Levantinism as an alternative to the melting pot, a cultural and social vision for Israeli society, since, as she writes, Israel is the location for a unique encounter between the two branches of diaspora Judaism, Ashkenazim and Sephardim. This encounter is a rare opportunity for the two branches to join together in creating a Levantine civilization, but only on condition that there is equality between the two cultures. In Israel, Kahanov sees the opposite, a great fear of Levantinism and a desire to eliminate Oriental elements from the culture created here in Israel. Let's finish by reading an extract of an essay called, entitled Black on White, in which she proposed Levantinism as a social and cultural vision for Israeli society. Israel is in a unique situation, since this process of reciprocity and mutual change takes place within the borders of that country, which is Levantine in terms of its geographical status between East and West, and due to the very mixing of its inhabitants. From this, it can combine the two main elements of its structures into a dynamic and creative unity, such as the great Levantine cultures of the past. Of course, Israel will not be able to march alone until the end of all generations. Nor it will be able to make peace with people who declare their hatred for it while in the exploding phase of self-creation. But to the extent that Israel is not afraid of its Levantinization, it may pave the way for some future peace. Israel may win precisely if it exemplifies a Levantine well integrated into his environment, one who does not deny any side of his legacy while creating his own values. So, as I said, she describes the fear of Levantinization on the part of Zionists with European origins, a fear that blinds them to the possibility of creating in Israel a great culture, a civilization created from the encounter of East and West. Naturally, this will only be possible if the two cultures meet on a level playing field. But today, she says, Israeli society sees Mizrahi culture as something inferior to be deleted and replaced by Western culture. So these are my words for now. There is a lot more to say. We met two Levantine women, very interesting Levantine women, who tried to change our dichotomic way of thinking about East and West. Two great humanists who seek to bring peace to this conflictual area by the combination of Eastern and Western culture. And that's it. I would love to hear your questions and comments in the left.
Thank you very much, Yafa. You're all welcome to open your mics and ask your questions directly. You don't need to use the chat. Yes, Rachel?
Yes, actually, my husband, Kenneth Brown, has a question. So I'll pass the computer over to him.
Okay. Professor Tzoref,
Shalom.
thank you very much. I have a question concerning, you were talking at length about Sephardic identity. And not Mizrahi identity, but Sephardic identity. So then you've talked about Arabic, of course. Before 1948, most Jews in the world lived in Arabic-speaking countries. But how about Spanish? When you're talking about Sepharad, you're talking about Spain. So in Al-Andalus, they were speaking Al-Arabiya, but they were also speaking Romance.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah. So
well,
what's happening then with Spanish as a factor in Sephardic identity for these women?
Well, you're right. I talked about modern history. And as you probably know, after the expulsion of the Jews of Spain, they dispersed and came to Europe on one part, but many of them went to the Ottoman Empire and to the Maghreb countries. And what happened there was that first they tried to keep their Spanish distinguished identity, but it didn't took long till the Maghreb Jews and the Spanish Jews become together. So when I say Sephardic in the modern epoch, I mean Sephardic and Mizrahi, because of this historical development after the expulsion from Spain. I don't talk about the Middle Ages, you know.
Okay.
Also, to find examples of feminist Jewish writing in Judeo-Spanish, you have Laura Papo Bojoreta, for example.
Yeah.
So the place of Spanish in the context of an Iraqi Jew and of an Egyptian Jew is a completely removed. It's completely removed from their historical context because Esther Muyal, la Esther Muyal connection to Spanish is it's like completely,
yes,
it's very, very far.
Yes.
Very, very far.
But it
Also,
seems
the term Mizrahim is a term of the short history of Mizrahim.
Israel.
When you talk about the long history, then you have to take into account a more broad identity than
100%.
this specific term.
I would say, just add, I'm a retired professor of medieval Spanish literature and linguistics. So linguistically speaking,
yes,
if an individual is going to make aliyah, in effect, to return to Eretz Yisrael, or to return to Sepharad, or to return to Arabic lands, which include also Israel, then you've got to go back to three languages: Hebrew, Arabic, and Spanish. So I wouldn't be surprised, even though, and I work a lot with Sephardic literature and linguistics. I wouldn't be surprised. It's a normal movement back to Spanish, just as Jews have made the movement back to Hebrew. And when I was teaching at the Hebrew University, my students were all fluent in Arabic. So there is a movement back to the sources, back to the roots. And the linguistic roots are very strong. You see that today, even unfortunately, in the war that's going on right now, the difference between, yes, I don't know how severe, how big the differences are, but the difference between Russian and Ukrainian, and the desire to hold on to that Ukrainian, or the desire to hold on to the Russian. I mean, part of the madness of the Russian invasion is connected to language too, unfortunately, but it is. So language psychologically is very, very important for going back to the source.
And I try to show that we talk about a multilingual society and reality. So if I can tell you about myself, I was born in Casablanca, as I told you, in Morocco, and I spoke French because we were westernized. I spoke Arabic. I spoke Hakitiya because my mother is from Larache.
From Larache?
Yeah, my mother.
My ex-wife was from Larache.
Okay.
Larache. I speak a little Hakitiya.
So you see, it's not one language. It's a multilingual reality, and this is the beauty. On the other hand, when you see the story of Jacqueline Kahano, she could not. The westernization was so strong that she could not speak Arabic anymore, and she wrote in English, and she doesn't have a mother tongue, which is quite tragic when you think about it, because you know, you talk about as a sort of a beautiful vision, but sometimes Levantinese is accompanied with a loss of languages, of native languages. And this is the story of Jacqueline Kahano, different from the story of Esther Moyal, of course.
Because there's this connection between Levantinism, cosmopolitanism, and empire. So there is a price, which is the price of the local languages, the familiarity. Also, something that I find very interesting about specifically the contribution of Jacqueline Kahano is we may speak about the loss of multilingualism under empire, but there's also a loss of this Sephardic multilingualism in Israel. How as a nation we have gone from being multilingual, which is more than some sort of cosmopolitan value. It also means the ability to be in between worlds and to mediate. So we have gone from being this people that spoke Hakiti at home and French at school and Arabic in the market, and to speaking only Hebrew, and to creating a reality in which knowing languages is something that comes with social status. not with the very fact of being a person in wherever it is that you live. And that is also a huge loss. And when Jacqueline Kahanoff defends this model of Levantinism for Israel, I think that's to me, that's what makes her so her feminist message so exciting, because she's not only saying we can be as good as the man, or we can be as good as the West, but we have actually something that this country needs in order to be better, in order to be a more reasonable place, in order to be a better place.
Yes,
I would agree.
Yes, yes, and when she comes to Israel in 1954, which is the time of the melting pot, she sees a very
provincial,
narrow nationalism, one language, one story, and she wants to make a renaissance of what she knew in Egypt, which disappeared also in Egypt. Okay,
of course,
because the nationalism invaded all this area. Yes,
for sure.
I would agree. Okay.
And there's this. Oh, Rachel, is there anything you want to add?
No, I'll let somebody else ask a question. Thank you.
Okay. Anybody else wants to say something, to ask something? Really feel free to open your mic and ask your question or make your comment. Yafa, while we wait for if someone has something to add, you were in the middle of saying something.
No,
right?
I know.
Okay. So
thank you.
I would like to hear. So when we were reading this speech of Esther Muyal, I like from a feminist perspective today.
Yes.
There is something that makes me at least uncomfortable today, and it's this idea, this defense of the values of patriarchy, this defense of how we can be as ready as anyone else for war, to compete, to be like the question, like, I guess to me the challenge today is no. What we don't want is any war to happen, any competition to be the model. What we don't want is patriarchy that leads us to think that those are the values, and that everything that women have done historically is just a burden and has no epistemic value. And no, that there's
it is an early feminism, and has some conservative traits, of course. She also speaks about the woman and her role in the family. Yes, she always speaks about the woman in the family, in order to persuade us importance of the feminism, because if to persuade, לשכנע אותנו.
To persuade, it's just that it got caught.
About the importance of the feminism, because if the woman is the educator of the next generations, yes, the fathers and the sons, so she has to have higher education. So we are in it is really a very early feminism. This is one point. The other point is that we can see it is not a post-colonial discourse yet. It is a discourse which is ambivalent, because on the one hand you can see even an envy of this West who succeeds so well, but in the other hand, the wish to combat, yes, the conquest and colonialism. And it is, as Jacqueline Kahanov stated, it is to be in between, the people in between the worlds, which is a complex situation, you know, and you can see it in her feminism. On the one hand, you can see they're all radical statements, but on the other hand, you can see conservative statements. Yes.
Yeah. No, but that is yeah, that is a very important point. That it's that is not post-colonial yet. So there is
right,
an ambivalence
right.
that is still not resolved. Yeah. Yeah, that is an important point. Well, Yafa, thank you so much for this fascinating talk and for sharing with us your knowledge and your time. And with this, we are closing our speaker series on women, tradition, and change in Israeli society. So thank you very, very much for being our last
pleasure.
speaker. Bye-bye. Bye-bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Thank you for participating.